Hi and welcome to Enchantment of Eternity's review for The Punisher Season 1. This video is where I review the newest installment in the Marvel Netflix catalog, The Punisher. The first part of this video will be spoiler free, so safe for those who haven't yet seen The Punisher. However, later in the video I will be getting into a spoiler section for those who have seen The Punisher in its entirety, but I will give a proper spoiler warning before doing so. So, this version of The Punisher was first introduced in Daredevil Season 2, and apparently it wasn't originally planned to be its own series, but they thought this version of The Punisher, played by Jon Bernthal, worked really well, and the viewer reception of The Punisher was extremely positive, so they decided to go ahead and give him his own show, and personally, I thought this was a brilliant decision. The show ended up being a unique entry in the Marvel Netflix catalog, as it turned out pretty different from all the other Marvel shows, which seemed more and more to have the tedious tendencies to try to connect to the larger Marvel universe and play on nostalgia by introducing more and more characters from the comic books and focusing on gimmicks that play on this nostalgia, whereas The Punisher doesn't really do that and comes off more as an independent story. Sure, it builds off of his backstory as seen in Daredevil Season 2, which includes his friendship to Karen Page, so we get a couple of cameos from a few side characters from Daredevil that The Punisher was involved with in his appearance on that show, but other than that, it remains pretty independent from the rest of the Marvel shows. Like when Karen went on the radio show, I was expecting it to be Trish Talk from Jessica Jones, but it wasn't. And when the Punisher got injured and he was close to death and Micro said he knew where to take him, I literally yelled, "Night Nurse!" But no, they didn't take him to Claire Temple, played by Rosario Dawson. In fact, this was the first Marvel Netflix show she didn't appear in. So the fact it's so self-contained mean it focuses more on the story that it's telling and not get bogged down in too many side plots and setting up other shows, which actually every season of Marvel Netflix shows has done since the first season of Daredevil and Jessica Jones. So when I saw the trailers for this show, they looked good, but I was worried it would just be a mindless action series without much character or story, but I was really wrong about that, as although the show certainly did contain a lot of action and some very graphic violence, so those who are into that sort of thing will be satisfied, but most of all, this was a drama show, and it followed a very emotional and character-based story, and as with the best of the Marvel Netflix shows, the best moments are character-based, emotional scenes, which I feel the show does a great job at. The show has a lot of powerful messages about PTSD, as that was integral to Frank Castle's storyline, as he's still haunted from his experiences in Afghanistan when he served there. But more than that, we get a lot of side characters, including a support group for veterans suffering from PTSD, and I think they tackle the subject in a very gritty and realistic way that expresses how difficult it is for these veterans and how war changes people. Now, the Punisher himself is more of an anti-hero than a hero, which I suppose he always has been even in the comics, so this right there separates him from the other Marvel Netflix superheroes. Even Jessica Jones, who always avoided the H word, is still more of a typical superhero than Frank Castle is, who is portrayed as multiple dimensions, not always in the right, and sometimes he can do stupid or outright immoral things, but the show does a great job of getting you to sympathize with him, and although he is relentless in killing his enemies, he still has a moral code when it comes to innocent bystanders, even police who are actively trying to arrest or perhaps even kill him. He still makes sure that they don't die, so that does help you to sympathize with him. That, along with the tragic loss of his family, which this show does an amazing job of portraying how this has devastated his life. So, the problem with the 1990 Dolph Lundgren film, The Punisher, is that it's just a typical action film that happens to be using the same names as the comic book characters. And the problem with the Thomas Jane 2004 Punisher was they treated it too much like a comic book and was just silly and over the top. And the problem with the 2008 Punisher Warzone movie is that it took the problems from both previous films as it came off as another generic action movie and it was too comic booky and over the top. This Punisher takes only the most realistic character-based aspects of the comic books, incorporates a lot of action, but in the way that serves an overall story where the focus is on the characters, and that's why this is by far the best adaptation of the Punisher ever created. And the story, for the most part, is well paced and builds in suspense slowly but steadily, not having too much filler, and builds to a great payoff. I say for the most part because there are some issues. There is an ongoing side plot involving another veteran suffering from PTSD that is mostly just filler and a waste of time, and the payoff to it was just really a sidestep that detracted rather than added to the story. And this show unfortunately suffers from the typical Marvel Netflix curse of having too many episodes, and the show would have been better had it been 10 or even 8 episodes long rather than 13. I heard a lot of people praise the first episode and refer to it as great, but honestly, I thought it was just okay. It was a tad bit cliched, but more to the point, completely irrelevant to the rest of the season. So honestly, I thought that could have been cut out entirely. And more than that, the last episode of the season was also unnecessary and could have been cut out, and the show would have been better for it. Episode 12 would have actually been a much better place to end, and after that episode, I kind of lost interest, and it really did feel like episode 13 did not need to exist. But other than those issues, the structure and pacing with the main story with Frank Castle was actually really good. So my rating for The Punisher Season 1 out of 10 is an 8, extremely good. I can confidently say that this is my third favorite Marvel Netflix season behind Season 1 of Daredevil and Season 1 of Jessica Jones, which were the first 2 seasons of the Marvel Netflix show to air. So in other words, The Punisher marks a return to form for the Marvel Netflix shows. It's certainly better than the other 2 Marvel Netflix shows that aired this year, Iron Fist and The Defenders. Both shows suffered from trying to be more family friendly and dull down the violence, where The Punisher without a doubt was the most violent of the Marvel Netflix shows yet to air, and it gets back to the gritty character based realism that made its first 2 shows so great. As I was watching it, it was on track to be my favorite of all the Marvel Netflix shows, but its unnecessary side plots that took up way too much time, as well as the totally unnecessary final episode, took it down a few notches for me, but it's still an amazing show and the best of the Marvel Netflix shows that we've seen since Jessica Jones. So hopefully a return to form, an indication of what is to come, and overall just a great watch in its own right. So now's the time where I get into my spoiler section. So if you haven't seen all of The Punisher Season 1, you will want to turn this video off now and come back at such a time as you have seen it, and thanks a lot for watching. But for those who have seen all of The Punisher Season 1, please follow me as I get into some spoilers, which begin now. So one of the show's biggest strengths is Micro and his storyline with his family and the fact that he was trying to get back to them. First off, David Lieberman made a really great sidekick as he handled the computer side of things while the Punisher did the killing. I like how Micro states this by saying even warheads need a guidance system. And this dynamic, of course, existed in the comics, and I don't remember the comics well enough to say which one works better, but I imagine that it works even better here because he seems seems to be taking more of a prominent role. And in the comics, he was a reformed hacker, whereas here he was an NSA analyst called Rogue, which is more in line with modern times, I suppose. And it seemed like he took more of a focus, particularly in this season, which I thought worked really well. In fact, one could argue he is the driving force of the whole season, as the main story is about him reuniting with his family. Sure, you could say the main plot is about Frank Castles trying to get revenge on the military men that betrayed him and helped kill his family, and that certainly was a part of it, but the heart of the story is about Lieberman being reunited with his family, and I think that's why the story works and doesn't come off as a stereotypical action movie revenge plot. And Lieberman's family storyline wasn't just about Lieberman, but had an amazing impact on Frank Castle's personal story, as he actually got to know and care about them, so I didn't consider any of the scenes with Frank hanging out with the Lieberman family to be filler or a waste of time, as I thought they all added very nicely to Frank's character story, because a major part of the Punisher mythos is that his family was killed, but it was an amazing story element to introduce another family that can serve as almost a surrogate to Frank's story, a family Frank cared about, but not enough to want for himself, as he still was in love with his own family, but enough for him to want to look after and care for. In fact, he even grew to see Lieberman as a surrogate for himself, of wanting to give him the happy life that he could not give himself, and that was an extremely touching story that added so much rich dynamic to the overall plot. Sure, it did degrade into the typical hold your family hostage storyline that we've seen a billion times before, but they didn't linger on that too long or too heavily, so it's easier to overlook, and the benefits of having this emotional through line far outweighed any drawbacks. It was so amazing seeing Lieberman reunited with his family, whom he thought was dead. I must admit to getting a bit teary-eyed several times, particularly the scene where he found his daughter, who was on the run after the rest of his family was abducted. However, the moment during the exchange where Lieberman was shot and it was played off like he'd been killed, I was thinking to myself, okay, if he is actually dead, if he's really dead, this is going to ruin the show for me entirely, and I'm going to hate it. But thankfully, it was indeed a fake out, and we weren't robbed of the cathartic payoff that we deserved. I mean, I like depressing endings from time to time. In fact, sometimes one of my favorite films of all time have depressing endings. But there are certain times where the story is constructed in such a way where you need to have a happy ending in order for it to be satisfying. Otherwise, it comes off as pretentious garbage trying to be all artsy and edgy, but really just sucks, like some very popular and beloved movies I could mention, but I won't get into that here. Suffice to say, this show doesn't do that, and it was great, and I give it a lot of credit for that. So let's talk about Madini, who was another great addition to the show. I didn't find her storyline a waste of time or filler or cliched at all. They managed to keep her fresh and original, and I loved the journey she went through to believing in what Frank was doing. I found it totally believable, and it made perfect sense, and I thought it stayed true to her character. And I actually liked the storyline of her romance with Billy Rousseau. It actually portrayed her as a fallible human being, and seeing her when she found out that she was betrayed was very satisfying. And the storyline of the trauma that she suffered when she watched her partner die was very powerful. And again, it didn't come off as cliched at all, when it very easily could have. I also loved the flashback and dream sequences Frank had with his wife and his family. Typically, I don't like those sort of things and typically find them jerk-off artsy wannabe filler, but for this show I actually think it added a lot to the story and helped explain the type of character that Frank is, and it made him more human, and it of course tied in nicely with the story of the trauma that he felt over their loss. I particularly liked the scene when he was being tortured and he went to his happy place where he was making love with his wife in order to deal with the pain. It made perfect sense, and I actually thought it was a beautiful touch. So, I also really like the villain of Agent Orange, aka Rawlings. In some ways, he does come off as the stereotypical villain, evil, bad guy, ordering people to be executed all willy-nilly and enjoying torturing people and whatnot. But in other ways, he can be dynamic as he believed he was on the right side and doing right by his country. In fact, he thought the ends justified the means, which is basically the same thing the Punisher does. So one could even debate that these two characters aren't all that different. Now, hear me out, because when the Punisher storms the military base, he talks about how he doesn't want to kill soldiers who are just doing their job. But later, when the Anvil soldiers storm Lieberman's hideout and the Punisher sets a trap and brutally kills them all, these Anvil soldiers, by and large, are just veterans who are just following orders and indeed trying to cope with returning to the real world after having served overseas. And he executes them brutally even after they surrendered or are clearly not a threat to him, an act done out of hatred and done particularly to get back at Rousseau, who specifically said later on that he doesn't care that there will always be more soldiers. So the Punisher is morally great, just like Rawlings. However, it is clear Rawlings is more despicable and has no moral code, as he killed Castle's whole family, women and children, as a strategy just to get Frank, which is something Castle would never do. So there are differences between them that do make the Punisher the hero and Agent Orange the villain, but these lines aren't so rigid and clear, particularly when compared to other superhero movies. And overall, I thought Agent Orange was a smart, diabolical villain with a lot of power, making him a very hard adversary to beat, which makes the best kinds of villains, so I thought this really worked. So now let me get into what I didn't like about the season, and since we're on the topic of villains, let me start with Billy Rousseau. Now apparently Billy Rousseau is the name of a comic book villain, Jigsaw, so those familiar with the comics could predict what would happen with this character based on that, but I didn't realize this when watching it. But as I always say, judging a work, you have to judge it independently of any source material. And my experience from watching this is I saw this character of Rousseau, who was like a war buddy of Frank's, whom he and they were friends and they trusted each other. I thought to myself, my God, I really hope that he doesn't turn out to be the villain, because that would be so incredibly cliched, but that's exactly what they did, and it was every bit as cliched and predictable as I feared. And overall, I did not think this was a good villain. He came off as more as a two-dimensional, doing evil things for the sake of being evil, and I didn't think it worked at all, and I thought the scenes with him and his mother was a complete waste of time. I didn't think it helped flesh his character out. He still felt fake and two-dimensional throughout. Didn't like him. But on that note, let me get into more detail on what I mentioned before about the final episode being completely unnecessary. The show should have ended in episode 12. After the Punisher killed Rawlings, they should have just had him kill Rousseau then and there as well, instead of having him get away and then creating a whole other episode where the Punisher has to chase after him, which, to be perfectly honest, we didn't need at all. It felt completely tacked on, and at this point I lost all interest in the show, because you knew exactly what would happen. The Punisher would track him down and then have an epic showdown, and that would lead to the Punisher defeating him. And it was so by the numbers and bland. But the part that pissed me off the most was they made a show of showing Medini track them down, but all she does is show up and get shot. But of course she doesn't die, so what a fucking waste. I mean, I thought they'd play into a great story of her getting revenge for Rousseau betraying her, sleeping with her after having killed her partner, or that she'd confront him about it and there'd be some sort of catharsis, some sort of resolution to this. But no, she just shows up and gets shot. Totally pointless. And then there's the whole contrived setup for Jigsaw, which the Punisher, messing up his face with the glass. And the moment he said, "I'm not going to kill you," I literally yelled at my screen. I yelled, "Oh, come on!" Because this is the single trope that irritates me the most, is when the hero comes time to kill the villain, but he doesn't, to show his moral superiority. It's such a dumb trope that I'm so sick of seeing. By the way, completely inconsistent and out of character for the Punisher. But to be fair, they did explain this, but it's not so much of the Punisher being heroic in saying, "I won't kill," but more of he felt a quick death was too easy for Russo, and he wanted him to suffer for much longer, to live in pain and misery after he took away his good looks and threw him in prison for the rest of his life. So in that way, it reminded me of the Gus Fring storyline, how he treated Hector Salamanca in Better Call Saul. So I was able to forgive it for that, because that does make some sense for the Punisher's character, that he would want Russo to suffer. But really, I think it would have made a lot more sense for Frank to just want to put Russo down for good, to prevent him from thriving or coming back or being a hindrance again, which you know is exactly what's going to happen. So in that way, it felt really contrived. And yes, I know this is what happened in the comics too, but again, that excuses nothing. If it can't be done in a way that doesn't come off as contrived plot convenience, then it shouldn't be done at all, regardless of what happened in the source material. And this is kind of what I mean about how they're contrively setting up for, supervillains in the comics that is going to happen. Like, oh, this is how his face gets messed up. It reminds me of, in the Defenders when Misty Knight got her arm blew off. Oh, this is how she gets her, say, cybernetic arm. Or how in the X-Men First Class, when Charles Xavier gets, shot in the leg, oh, that's how he gets pressed. It's just too contrived, and I don't like this sort of thing. And then there was a side plot with Lewis Wolcott, the veteran suffering from PTSD that Frank's friend Curtis was trying to counsel. Now, there were parts of this storyline I found interesting. For instance, the scene where he nearly accidentally killed his own father because he was suffering from nightmares, and to see his father try to connect to him was very powerful stuff. I just feel like it belonged in another show, as it felt kind of like an aside that added nothing to the main plot of the show, and more to the point, what they did with this story, with turning him into a bomber, was completely unnecessary and detracted rather than added to the story. The season would have been much better had they left this whole storyline out entirely, and I absolutely hated the character of the gun control senator, who came off as a walking, talking straw man for what NRA advocates think gun control advocates sound like, but no one actually says these things in real life. And then they have Karen come on and make what they present as reasonable down-the-middle arguments, but all she's really doing is ripping apart straw mans that no one in real life is actually saying. And to be fair, I'm sure Wolcott and the other fake veteran guy were also stereotypes of how those who are against gun control think. So the entire issue was handled extremely poorly and oversimplified to an almost cartoonish level for both sides of the argument, which in my opinion does a huge disservice to this very serious issue. So honestly, I saw this as the show's biggest flaw that held it back the most for me, but that's just me. But as I said, I did really enjoy the show overall and felt its strength did far outweigh its weaknesses. The character story with Castle connecting with Lieberman's family and working towards the goal of reuniting him with them, while at the same time getting revenge for his family, was a very powerful one that worked out really well, and it was constructed beautifully. And this is helped by other strong supporting characters like Medini and Curtis, and a very powerful, well-constructed villain with Agent Orange. And so the whole storyline was just constructed very well. So this could have been the best Marvel Netflix show, but it was bogged down a bit by the unnecessary side plot and unnecessary first and final episodes. So in short, this season would have been much better had it been shorter, which is true about pretty much every Marvel Netflix show save The Defenders, which actually should have been longer. So you keep hoping that they'll learn this lesson, but maybe they will eventually, who knows. So So that's it for my review of The Punisher Season 1. Be sure to check out my channel as I cover many other shows like Star Trek, Game of Thrones, The Expanse, Mr. Robot, and more. So be sure to subscribe so you can keep up with all of that. And thanks a lot for watching.